In photography, exposure is the amount of light which reaches your camera's image sensor. It is a crucial part of how bright or dark your pictures appear. Take a look at this photograph. The center of the photograph is the correct exposure. There's good detail in the highlighted areas, such as the sky, and also good detail in the rock, in the shadow areas here where it's a bit darker. In the right part of the photo, there's not enough light reaching the image sensor, so the image was underexposed. The left part of the photograph is overexposed, meaning too much light reached the image sensor, leaving a lot of areas too bright, lacking detail. As the artist of your photograph, you have to decide how light or dark you want your exposure. Look at this series of images. This is the same image at different exposures. This is a nighttime photograph, so the exposure should be quite dark, but you still want to make it so that you see a lot of detail as well. The first photograph is a little too overexposed. The areas of brightness are lacking a lot of detail, whereas the last photograph is too underexposed. There wasn't enough light in the image, so you don't have much detail at all. Somewhere in between would be a good exposure, but you have to make that decision as the photographer as to what you want to portray. If you need to show more detail in the grass areas, you would choose a lighter exposure. If you wanted to emphasize maybe the glowing lights or the glowing lit up areas of the building, you might choose a darker exposure. There's not an exact answer. If you look at this photograph, the one in the middle is the proper exposure. As you go to the right, the image gets brighter and you lose detail in the light areas. When you start at the center and go to the left, the image gets darker and you lose detail in the darker part of the areas. If you look at these darker images, the sky actually has a little bit more detail. If you look at the lighter images, the foreground actually has a little bit more detail because it's lightened up. So you kind of have to find the happy medium of the exposures and decide what you want to be visible and what you want to show the most detail. So the one in the middle seems to show the best detail in the sky and in the foreground. When the camera is set to the manual setting, you can adjust your exposure manually to get your images exactly how bright or how dark you want them. To choose the proper exposure for your image, you'll have to use the light meter. The light meter can be found in 3 different places on your camera. It can be found on the back of your camera here, inside the viewfinder, in here. When you press the shutter release button, it should show up inside the viewfinder. And then the third place is in this live camera mode. Some of our cameras have this and some do not. When you press the live camera mode and you tap the shutter release button, you can see at the bottom of the screen, you can see there is a light meter there as well. This is what the back of your camera menu should look like. I'm in the manual setting, and here is my light meter. The light meter is used to set the exposure that you want for your image. It measures the amount of light coming in through your camera and hitting the image sensor. When you point your camera at a subject to take the picture, the camera is going to measure the amount of light coming in. If there's too much light coming into the camera, this little indicator here will show up towards the positive side. If there's not enough light, this indicator will be somewhere over here in the negative range. The brighter the image is, the further towards the right this little indicator will be. The darker the image is, the further towards the left this little indicator will be. This is what it looks like when you look through your viewfinder to take the picture. If you look here, this is your light meter. This is the proper exposure. This is the light meter with your image a little bit brighter, because as you go to the right, remember, the further you go this way, the brighter your picture will get. This is an example of a little bit darker photo because it's not right at the middle. You've darkened the photo for whatever reason. It's at a -1. You can continue to move this indicator towards the left and it will get darker and darker. You can move this indicator to the right and it should get brighter and brighter and brighter. So this scale continues on, but in your viewfinder, you're only going to see up to a +2 or 3. But know that if it's stuck here, it could be way, way too bright and it could be further down the line. This scale continues on, but it only shows you a small portion of it. This sample image shows exactly how exposures correlate to your light meter. So if you see here, the 0 correlates to the center of your light meter. So this is just an example of how your image might look at a 0, at a +1, at a +2, it gets brighter, -1, -2, it gets darker and darker and darker. So the further left you go into the negatives, the darker and darker your images are going to get. The further right, the brighter and brighter and brighter. And you can always choose the option in between. There's several different ticks between the 0 and the +1, say. So you could choose an image that's just a little brighter than this one by scrolling over into the positive. And you could choose an image that's a little bit darker than at the middle or at the 0 by scrolling a little bit into the negative. So there's full stops, but then there's also in between those stops too. So this is where you get full control of how bright or dark your image will be. So here's a look on the camera. The little indicator on the light meter here is flashing in the negative. That means my picture is going to be very, very dark. If you notice, it only flashes for a moment and then my screen goes dark. So to get your little indicator to show up underneath your light meter, you have to tap and hold down the shutter release button. If you wait too long to make an adjustment, that will just disappear and you have to tap the button again. So this is how you set your light meter. I'm going to point my camera in the area I want to take the picture. I can see if I move my camera in different directions, the light meter setting will change because different amount of light is coming into the camera in different directions that I point. So you want to get your camera all set up, zoomed in and focused, and then use the light meter. You have to use the light meter with every picture that you take when you're in manual mode. So I've got my shot all set up, and what I'm going to do is tap the button. I'm going to look through, when I generally take a picture, I look through the viewfinder and you're going to see this light meter in the viewfinder when you tap the button to take the picture. This is the easiest way to see it because in bright sunlight, it's really hard to see the back of the screen. So I'm going to tap the button and I'm going to start scrolling with this dial right away. And this dial is going to move that little indicator. And what I want to do is get it right to the center of the picture. So right away, I'm going to move this around and get it to the center. And that's where my proper exposure should be. Well, that's where the camera thinks the proper exposure should be. So I will take a picture at 0 first. And if I think it's too bright at 0, then I can take a picture and scroll towards the negative and it should darken up. If the picture's too dark when you take it at 0, you can go this way, and the further you go to the positive, the brighter the picture is going to get. Now, of course, I didn't focus this picture, but you can still see something showed up, and it gets different variations of exposure from light to dark. So every time you take a picture, start by getting the indicator right to the middle at 0. And I'm doing that by, first I tap this for the light meter to show up, and then I start moving this dial. Canons can be a little counterintuitive because when you're moving this dial, if you want the indicator, if it's over here, see mine is flashing on the left here, I want to move it this way to get it to the middle because over here is going to be way too dark. But in order to move it to the right, I actually have to scroll my finger to the left. So you have to scroll your finger the opposite way that you want the indicator to move. So you just kind of have to get used to that with Canons. So if it's all the way over and it's too bright, I actually have to scroll my finger. Like I need to move the indicator to the 0. So it needs to go left, but I actually have to scroll my finger to the right in order to do that. So you kind of have to get used to the way to scroll in order to get that light meter to move. Now, if you scroll too far in one direction, it could just keep blinking and blinking and blinking. I have to scroll a long time to the left right now in order to get that to move back to center. So if it's not moving, just keep scrolling. On the other side, if you're all the way to the right of the meter, it's going to turn to bulb. So bulb means you've gone too far. You've got to scroll the other way. We're going to use bulb. It's a setting coming up here, but you want to get it to the middle. So sometimes if you see bulb, if it's not going away, scroll the opposite way. It'll go away. And you want to be at the center. Okay, so when looking out over the classroom, I'm going to take a picture using my light meter. So I'm going to tap the button up here where I take the picture and then start scrolling right away to get it to the center point. So you can see I get an image that appears. If my little indicator was buried somewhere in like the negative, my image would be too dark, as you can see here. If it's all the way to the positive, my image is going to be too bright. The further I go into the positive, the brighter my image gets. The further I go into the negative, the darker it gets. So I always start out by taking a picture right in the middle. And then I assess from there whether is it too bright or too dark. If the image is too bright when I initially take it at 0, I could go over into the negative to darken it up. I could go 1 or 2 ticks. I don't have to go completely to the 1. Remember, any little bit that you move, it's actually going to darken it more and more. So it should get a little darker. And then if I go over into the positive, it should brighten up my image. The further I go, the brighter it'll get. Live view on your camera is a great way to practice. So it closes off the viewfinder, so you have to take the picture by looking at the screen. But look, when I hold down the actual button to take the picture, just gently hold it down, I can see the viewfinder, or I'm sorry, I can see the light meter showing right up. And I can start scrolling my finger and get it to the middle. But look at it, it's giving me a preview of what the image will look like. So this is at the center. And then if I go to the left, to the negative, I'm actually scrolling my finger to the right, but it's going to the negative, it'll get darker. So it's giving me a preview, which is kind of cool for practicing. Like I said, I don't generally like this mode. It's a little harder to focus, but it's great for practice to kind of see how that works. You may have noticed that your images, while being the proper exposure, may still be blurry or out of focus. To manipulate all aspects of your image, you really need to know how to set the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Remember, all 3 of these elements work together to give you your proper exposure. But without setting each one specifically the way that you want it, your images will not turn out. So please watch the following videos to understand how to set your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO so that you can get your desired pictures.